Before we begin, tell me something quietly, just between us. What time is it where you are, and where in the world are you listening from tonight? Let me know in the comments below. I always read them. And if you're new here, gently, press subscribe before we start. Now close your eyes and drift with me.
You open your eyes in the quiet gray of a Tudor winter morning, but this is not your home. The wooden beams above your head are soot, darkened, and thick with spiderwebs. The walls are stone, damp, and cold enough to pull the warmth out of your bones. The rushes on the floor crackle faintly as you shift, the scent of yesterday's ashes and chamber pot straw curling into your nose. You are in a back corner of Hampton Court Palace, in the servants' quarters, and today you are the new apprentice bed warmer. It is not a job of glory, nor is it even considered terribly clean, but it is a job, and for someone with no inheritance, no noble title, and no trade. It is a path toward food, shelter, and maybe, if your fingers are swift and your tongue is silent, a future in the royal household. You rise before any bells have rung. It is not yet prime, the first liturgical hour of the day, and certainly not yet time for the king to stir. But the embers and the warming pan must be prepared well in advance. The senior bed warmer, an aging man named Ellis, who has been in service since the days of young Prince Henry, meets you in the scullery. He says little. He doesn't need to. He hands you a round brass warming pan, dented and blackened with decades of use. Its handle is long, and the lid is perforated with flower-shaped holes. Inside, there is nothing yet, just the echo of countless fires that have come and gone. He instructs you, go to the lower hearth, fetch coals from the wood ash, no sparks, no flames, only the hot heart of it. You walk briskly. The quarter stones are cold under your feet. You wear thick wool socks inside leather shoes, and even still, your toes ache. The servants' hall is beginning to stir yawns, clinks of kettles, distant mutterings in Latin from the chapel. A kitchen boy crosses your path, his apron already smeared with barley and chicken lard. He nods. You nod. The hierarchy of the Tudor household is unspoken but absolute. The queue are beneath even the kitchen. Scullions, at least for now, in the hearth beneath a crust of gray ash, are the remains of last night's fire. With iron tongs, you lift the glowing coals into your pan. They hiss faintly against the dry air. You close the lid carefully. The coals must be hot enough to warm the feather mattress, but not so hot that they scorch the linen or start a fire. More than one servant has lost his position for careless singes. Ellis is waiting for you back in the royal bedchamber antechamber. This is the first of many lessons. You may warm the king's bed, but you may never speak to the king. You may never look him in the eye. You may not enter the chamber alone. You are not allowed to be seen, only to serve. The hand that warms the bed, Ellis mutters, must be cooler than the king's temper. You learn that the royal mattress is not a single item, but a stack of layers, straw mattress at the base, followed by a feather bed, covered in linen sheets embroidered with a royal cipher. Above that, a padded coverlet, and atop that, a fur-lined blanket. The warming pan must be slid gently between the sheets in long, smooth passes, never resting in one spot, never scraping the surface. Too slow, and you risk scorch marks. Fast, and you leave the bed cold. But the technique isn't the hardest part. The hardest part is the timing. The king does not rise at the same hour every day. His schedule shifts with Parliament, with hunting parties, with his illnesses and moods. You must warm the bed so that it is precisely ready 10 minutes before he enters it. No sooner, no later. To do this, you must observe the king's patterns, his pacing, his appetite, his sighs, his silences. You become attuned to rhythms of power not written in any ledger. Ellis tells you stories during idle moments. Once, he says, King Henry summoned a new servant boy to explain why the bed felt clammy. The boy hadn't let the pan rest long enough near the headboard. He was dismissed. Another time, a warmer forgot to secure the pan lid properly. Ash spilled onto the linen. A burn mark the size of a crown remained. Ella says the queen, which queen, he doesn't say, for there were several, was furious. She called it an insult to the sanctity of rest. You listen and remember, your first solo attempt comes on the third morning. Ellis watches. You feel the heat rising up through the brass handle. Your hand is steady. You lift the coverlet. Insert the pan and begin your passes. One across the foot of the bed, one across the middle, one up by the pillow. You rotate the pan to keep the heat even. You hear nothing but the low hum of the coals and the creak of the canopy bed as the chambermaids fold down the furs behind you. Then Ellis gives a subtle nod. You withdraw the pan, dust it off with a cloth soaked in vinegar, and return it to the scullery. No applause, no words, but in the still air of that chamber, you feel something stir, a trace of pride perhaps, or simply relief. Later that day, in the servants' hall, you find a half-heel of bread left on the table for you. Someone has also placed a slice of soft cheese beside it. No one says it aloud, but you know what it means. You did well. Your job is invisible, but important. If the king sleeps well, the kingdom flows more smoothly. If he wakes with aches or Jill's policy is delayed, meetings are shortened, decisions are made in haste. Sleep is political, and warming the bed, this menial, quiet task, is a small thread in the vast tapestry of court life. You begin to notice how the role of a bed warmer connects you to other servants, the laundresses who wash the singed linens, the carpenters who repair the slats, the upholsterers who stitch the feather casings, even the court astrologer who sets sleep hours based on the moon's position indirectly affects your schedule. The bed, it seems, is the final destination of many labors. One morning, as frost curls on the inside of the windows and the hearths are late to be let, Ellis does not appear. A chambermaid informs you quietly that he has taken ill. You are now warming the bed alone, not just preparing the pan, but deciding when and how long to warm, reading the king's moods through second-hand reports from guards and secretaries. Wait if it sinks in. If you get it wrong, the king will know, and if he knows, you may be dismissed. But if you get it right, if he sleeps well, eats heartily, and smiles at breakfast, your success will be known only by silence, no praise, just the absence of reprimand, as you light the coals that morning. Question arises, slow and curling like the smoke itself. How many other hands across history, unseen and unthanked, shaped the sleep of the powerful? The weeks pass like the slow drift of frost over a Tudor window pane. You rise before the sun and fall asleep long after it sets. Your muscles sore from hauling wood buckets and brass pans. Your fingers singed more than once by stray cinders. Yet you begin to understand the rhythm of this strange, invisible duty. Each morning, the castle breathes. The courtyards groan with the squeal of cartwheels. The chambermaids slap linens against stone to shake out the night's dust. The chapel. Bells clang. Spiced air from the kitchen mingles with the cold, damp breath of the Thames. And through it all, you move quietly with your pan. You are no longer merely the apprentice. Ellis's illness has grown worse. He now spends most of his hours confined to his cot behind the scullery, coughing through ragged layers of wool. The physicians pass him by without urgency. He is, after all, a servant, and servants are expected to fade from view. So you serve, alone. But it is in solitude that you begin to notice the deeper patterns of the court, those not written in proclamations or schedules. You begin to learn, for instance, that the king's sleep patterns are governed not only by politics or astrology, but by his digestion. If he eats too much mutton, he tosses. If he drinks heavily, he rises late and complains of back pain. You adjust the bed accordingly, warmer at the small of the back, cooler near the chest. A subtle shift he never remarks upon, but one that he seems to register, if only through silence. You also begin to learn about the power structures that exist among the royal servants themselves. There is a hierarchy even among the invisible. The valet outranks the laundress, cooks second outranks the herbalist, and the page, that impish, clever-eyed boy who carries the king's gloves, outranks you all. You are at the very bottom, but there is something oddly liberating about that from the bottom. You can see everything, and what you see is that power rarely announces itself with shouting. It whispers. It shifts slightly in the night. It leaves crumbs behind in the folds of a royal bed. One evening, you are called to the queen's quarters. This is unusual. The queen typically keeps her own maids and is attended by her personal chamberwomen. But tonight, the usual warmer is ill, and her ladies-in-waiting refuse to risk soot on their gowns. You are fetched without explanation. The queen, this one is Jane Seymour, is not present when you arrive. Her ladies are finishing the final turn-down of the bed. They barely acknowledge you, except to give curt instructions. Do not pass the pan more than thrice across the bolster. Her Majesty prefers it cool. You nod. Your hands obey. You warm quickly and evenly when you are done. The youngest of the ladies, a pale girl no older than you, with ink-stained fingers, gives you a single nod of approval. It is the only acknowledgement you will receive. As you leave, you pass the corridor of tapestries, great golden things depicting the biblical triumphs of kings. You pause before one. In it, a kneeling servant holds a crown on a cushion. His face is nameless. His eyes are downcast. No one will ever know who he was. The next day, Queen's page delivers a message. Her Majesty has requested that you warm her bed again that evening. You are stunned. Requests are rare. Preferences, even rarer. Ellis once told you that the best compliment a servant can receive is repetition. You're beginning to understand what he meant. That night, you attend to both beds. First, the Queen's, then the King's. You move silently, your pan swinging like a slow pendulum, humming faintly with the breath of hot coals. You now have a rhythm. 6 slow passes for the King, 3 gentler ones for the Queen. You know their preferences like a musician knows chords, and still. No one speaks your name, but something changes. You begin to receive better bread in the morning, slightly more butter. Your bed near the scullery is moved slightly closer to the hearth. One morning, you find a new woolen cap folded on your cot. Your old one had developed holes. No one tells you why. No one needs to. You are now part of the fabric of the palace, as woven into its routine as the candle snuffers and the silver polishers. You have become a silent gear in the mechanism of royal rest. One stormy evening, as the Thames lashes against the palace walls, a message comes. The King has ordered his bed to be warmed for an early rest. He is exhausted, having argued all day with his council over matters of succession and taxation. You move swiftly. Your pan is already heating, but as you enter the antechamber, the valet stops you. The King has changed his mind, he says. He's gone to pray in the chapel. Delay warming by 20 minutes. This is a delicate situation. If you wait too long, the bed will be cold. If you go too soon, it will cool by the time he returns. You decide to prepare the pan and wait outside the chamber, counting each passing minute by the ticking of the lantern oil dot at exactly the 20th minute to begin. But something is wrong. As you make your second pass under the linen, you feel resistance. Not fabric, not padding. Something tucked between the sheets. You pause. Your fingers brush it lightly. Paper. A folded parchment. You are not supposed to see it. You know this instinctively, but you cannot ignore it. Your eyes flick to the door. No one is watching. You glance at the seal. It bears the Queen's mark. A letter hidden in the king's bed. You slide it further beneath the bolster, untouched, and you continue your passes. Your pan hums quietly as if it, too, were keeping a secret. Later that week, the queen's page is dismissed. Quietly. No explanation. Just a new boy in his place, his eyes wider, his smile too eager. You say nothing. No one asked. The politics of sleep are more complex than you imagined. One morning, Ellis calls for you. His voice is thinner now. You kneel by his cot. He is wrapped in 3 wool blankets and still shivers. He beckons you close. There is something you must know, he says. The king, he had a bed warmer once, long before me. A woman, clever hands, sharp eyes. She left in the night. No one said why, but the king did not sleep well for a month. After that, you ask what happened to her. Ellis smiles faintly. Sometimes silence is the best survival. Sometimes it is the only power we have. He dies 3 days later. You are not given time to mourn. The household must continue. The coals must be lit. But that night, as you slide the warming pan beneath the king's sheets, your hands slower than usual. You wonder how many others have held this pan. How many secrets have they seen, brushed gently beneath the linens of royalty, and chosen to let lie? And how many nights of history have depended on the simple, careful silence of someone like you? By the time the frost returned to Hampton Court, you had been warming beds for nearly 2 full winters. You moved through the stone passages of the royal palace like a ghost in livery, known by your footsteps, unseen by design. In the dark, hours before midnight, the lords and ladies had long retired and the courtiers whispered their final secrets into candlelight. You were just beginning your rounds. The death of Ellis had changed something in you. It wasn't grief, exactly, not the sort reserved for family or friendship, but something colder and stranger, a recognition. Ellis had not been a hero. He had not spoken truth to power, but he had served, hand in his quiet, blistered hands, had been a thread that helped keep the entire Tudor court stitched together. You had picked up that thread, and now it was yours to carry on the coldest nights, when even the hearts smoked more than they glowed. Your job became almost sacred. The warming pan no longer felt like a tool. It felt like a ritual object, something half religious. Every pass under the sheets had to be timed. Every ember had to be shaken, just enough to breathe, but not enough to burn. You knew how to swirl the pan in tight arcs to heat the footboard, how to hover just long enough over the small of the mattress, so the king's joints, swollen with age and rot, might ache less. You knew too that sometimes warmth was not physical, it was political. There was a night the ambassador from Spain arrived unexpectedly, and a room in the Queen's wing had to be prepared, hastily, but with a dignity worthy of foreign eyes. The Queen requested your warming hand. You arrived, before the ambassador, warming the mattress for someone whose name you would never hear, whose letters would carry power you'd never understand. You performed the task as if you were folding a letter of state. Not a wrinkle, not a burn. It's quiet heat. There was another night more curious, when you were summoned to the quarters of Lady Rochford, cousin of the Queen, widowed, sharp-tongued, and always dressed in mourning silk. She greeted you at the door herself, unusual, and instructed you to wait while she prepared the chamber, which she finally allowed you inside. The bed was already turned down. She simply gestured to it and said, "Make it feel like memory." You did, and when you left, she gave you a coin. Not the usual farthing, but a gold angel. You never spoke of it again in your 3rd winter. The king's health declined rapidly. His legs, already ulcered and swollen, required constant dressing. He no longer climbed stairs. A hoist had to be installed in his private chambers. His sleep became erratic. Sometimes he refused to lie down. Other times he demanded 2 warmings in the same evening, once at twilight, and again before dawn. He began to speak more during your rounds. Not to you, not directly, but to the air. Some nights he muttered to God, begging for sons. Other nights he cursed Wolsey, Thomas More, or himself. Once he said something strange. All the beds in Christendom, and still no rest, said nothing. You merely warmed. Then came the evening that changed everything. It was late autumn, and the court was preparing for another round of marriage discussions. The king had already lost Jane Seymour, and though his mourning was public, privately the pressures of alliance never stopped. There were rumors he might pursue another continental bride. There were even whispers of young Catherine Howard. That evening the chamber was still. The king was to retire early. You arrived with your pen as usual, but something was different. The room was heavy, not with smoke or damp, but with presence, as though it was watching you. You began your task. On your second pass, beneath the bolster, you once again brushed something, not fabric. Another letter. This time you paused. Your heart beat slower, not faster. You had learned control. You did not read it. You did not touch it. But you did register its seal, not the Queen's. This time it bore the mark of the Duke of Norfolk, a powerful man, one who moved silently through the cracks of the court. A man who, they said, had placed more than one cousin in a royal bed. You finished your warming. You did not mention the letter. You simply bowed and left. But 2 days later, the Queen's lady-in-waiting, the ink-fingered girl, was removed from court, sent to a nunnery. The reason? Its inappropriate closeness to matters of state. You said nothing. Weeks passed. And then, one cold December morning, you were summoned not to the king or queen, but to the Lord Chamberlain himself, a man whose name you had only heard in murmurs. His eyes were pale, his hands delicate and dry, like paper ready to tear. He gestured for you to sit. You did not. I hear, he said slowly, that you've never once scorched the linen. Heart. You've never asked a question you shouldn't, that you arrive when called and vanish when dismissed. Is this true? You nodded. He smiled faintly. Good. There are two kinds of men the king trusts. Those who are too dumb to understand what they see, and those wise enough to pretend they didn't. He leaned forward. There is a new duty. A chamber behind the Queen's apartments, unmarked. You will warm it when called. No one will speak of it. Do you understand? You nodded again. That night, you were brought to the room, small one. No more than a servant's closet, but with fresh linens and velvet drapes. You warmed it, slowly, carefully. There was no bed, only a couch. And beside it, a small table with a cup already filled with wine. You never asked who would sleep there. You never saw, but you warmed it every fortnight. By the time spring arrived, you had served in near silence for over 3 years. You had watched queens come and go, courtiers rise and fall. You had warmed beds that would lead to heirs, and beds that would lead to executions. Cute, you had watched the political machine breathe in its sleep, and you had kept it warm. Then one day, it ended. A younger boy, rosy-faced, eager, and too clean, was assigned to assist you. Within a week, he was doing your rounds alone. The Lord Chamberlain sent you a message. Your service has been exemplary. You are dismissed with gratitude and silence. They gave you a cottage pension, enough to keep you fed. And when you slept in your own bed for the first time, one you had warmed only for yourself, you found you couldn't rest. The mattress was too cold. You had no pan, no duty, no footsteps echoing down stone corridors. Just silence. Years later, no one remembered your name. You were never painted, never praised. But in the diaries of a physician who served the last years of King Henry's reign, there is a single note. The king now sleeps poorly. since the departure of his warming servant. His limbs ache, and his dreams trouble him. He mutters for warmth, but no pan brings him peace. And you, wherever you had gone, slept soundly, because you had seen the true machinery of kingship, the place where history and linen met, the quiet furnace beneath the crown, and you had made it warm. If you had ever wondered what kept a Tudor palace running, truly running, it was not the monarch's will or a steward's ledger. It was hierarchy, invisible, unbreakable, absurd hierarchy. And if you were a servant in the Tudor era, especially in the grand labyrinths of Hampton Court or Whitehall, you were not just a body to do a task. You were a rung on a ladder, a carefully measured thread in a human tapestry that could be pulled tight or quietly snipped. And yes, sometimes you warmed beds, but far more often you waited, you bowed, you fetched, and you memorized rules that no one ever wrote down, but everyone instinctively obeyed. Let's begin at the very bottom, where new boys entered the household at perhaps 9 or 10 years old. They weren't paid. They weren't even considered in service in the full sense. These were the pages, the scullions, the spit boys, the boys who turned the heavy iron rods over open flames to roast meat for hours, who washed the soot from fireplace grates before dawn, who scrubbed chamber pots while trying not to breathe too deeply. No one asked their names. They were given orders in grunts, nods, and kicks. Some ran away within weeks. Those who stayed learned fast. Don't speak unless spoken to. Never look a noble in the eye, and keep your hands behind your back when standing still. Not for respect, but so you didn't steal. Above them were the actual wage-earning servants. These included the yeoman and groom's titles, which sound romantic now, but were really just a polite way of saying, you clean this and not that. A groom of the chamber, for instance, had the distinct honor of sweeping floors where courtiers walked, but a groom of the stool, he helped the king relieve himself. And paradoxically, that made him far more powerful, because in Tudor hierarchy, proximity to royalty, even in the most intimate and undignified moments, meant trust, and trust was currency. You see, the Tudor world didn't run on silver alone. It ran on information. Who said what? Who was seen? Where? Which noble's hand lingered a second too long on the queen's sleeve? A humble-looking servant might be closer to the beating heart of the court than any baron, by being in the right corridor at the wrong time, which is why even servants were watched and categorized. There were the above-stairs staff, visible to the royal family, tasked with maintaining a veneer of grace and efficiency. And then there were the below-stairs staff, cooks, porters, washerwomen, whose names would never be recorded unless they caused a scandal. Every action had its place, and so did every person. Even the way servants interacted with each other was structured. A yeoman could not eat with a gentleman usher. A laundry girl could not enter the West Wing without permission from the under-housekeeper. And God help you, if you crossed into a hall during a royal procession, there are accounts of young pages being beaten for standing in a doorway as the king passed, not because they blocked him, but because their presence was seen as a disruption of order. Then there were the unspoken codes of honor. A servant never touched another servant's tools. If you worked in the buttery, you did not clean the stables. If you prepared ink for a clerk, you never poured wine for a guest. If you warmed beds, you did not stoke the public hearth. Crossing those lines was seen not just as impolite, but as a threat to the order of the household. Now imagine hierarchy, not as a rigid column, but as a wheel. At its center, the royal family, kin. From there, concentric rings spiraling outward. The nobles, the high-ranking servants, the lesser attendants, the tradesmen, the invisible workers, and finally, the street beyond the gate. Every ring dependent on the ones closer to the center, and every mistake radiating outward like a crack in stained glass, and still, somehow, the entire thing functioned. Take, for instance, the distribution of meals. The Tudors loved ceremony. Even eating was a matter of ritual. When the king dined, it wasn't just a private act, it was a performance. Dishes were announced. Tastes were tested for poison. Linen cloths were unfolded with precision. And for every dish that reached the royal table, there were dozens that never did, prepared by a culinary army behind the scenes. But that food didn't go to waste. It was distributed down the chain, first to nobles and favored guests, then to upper servants, then to the yeomen. What remained trickled further still, and by the end of the day, the lowliest boy in the scullery might chew a piece of crust that at once rested inches from the king's knife. Even leftovers obeyed the hierarchy. Linen worked the same way. When a noblewoman discarded a gown, it was often cut down and restitched for her maid. When that maid's dress grew threadbare, it might be worn by a kitchen assistant. When it finally tore at the seams, it became a cleaning rag or strips for wrapping wounds. Every object, every action, every ounce of heat or labor passed through invisible hands, each pair trained to know exactly where they stood. And while all this hierarchy might sound suffocating, to the servants who understood it, was strangely comforting, predictable, stable. You knew when to speak, how to stand, and whom to serve. You knew that the man who emptied the king's chamber pot had more influence than the noble who dined once a year with the crown. You knew that the washerwoman who saw the queen's birth blood might whisper secrets more powerful than courtly poets ever wrote. And in all of this, in every soot-stained finger and every bow scraped against stone floors, there was dignity. Quiet, invisible dignity. The kind of dignity that came from knowing that if the servants vanished, the entire palace would fall, and fall fast. But what happened when the rules broke? What happened when a servant stepped above his station? That question, once unthinkable, began to creep into the Tudor consciousness as the decades wore on, as old families lost favor and new faces arrived at court with ambition sharper than blades. Suddenly, a well-placed footman could become a private secretary. A lady's maid might catch a prince's eye. The wheel spun faster. Some tried to leap across its spokestod. In the next section, we'll follow the story of one such leap, a servant who dared to step into the world of nobles. But ask yourself this first. If your place was low, but safe, would you risk everything just to rise? Let us now return to the inner workings of a Tudor palace, a world humming just beneath the marble and velvet, like the machinery inside a gilded clock. And let us now follow the quiet tremors caused by one man's decision to nudge that machinery, just slightly out of rhythm. His name was William Keeling. He is not famous. He was not a knight or a lord. There are no statues of him, no poems, no fine tomb, but there is a faint mention in the payroll register of Hampton Court. Around the year 1535, 2 shillings awarded to Mr. Keeling, assistant to the gentleman of the cellar, for service beyond assigned duty. That is all. Yet that faint line, lost in ink and dust, tells of a moment where the hierarchy bent. The gentleman of the cellar was a coveted position. Wine was serious business in Tudor courts, and not just because of taste. The quality of wine was linked to diplomacy, to celebration, to royal health. Serving spoiled claret to a visiting ambassador could insult a nation. Offering sweetened sack during Lent could scandalize the clergy. So the man who controlled the cellar was powerful, but the man who cleaned it, the one who shifted barrels and scrubbed mold from the stone walls, was invisible. William Keeling was that invisible man. For nearly a decade, he rose before dawn, worked through the damp, and often ended his day with his hands stained purple from spills that could never be mentioned. He did not speak unless spoken to. He did not linger in the hallway. He did not ask questions until one afternoon, that day, the king's physician had sent word His Majesty would be dining with a visiting Venetian. The wine must be light, clear, and served chilled. This was no small feat. England had no icehouses worth the name. Cooling a bottle in Tudor times meant submerging it in spring water, shaded by stone, and hoping the sun stayed mild. But the gentleman of the cellar, a man named Rafe Godfrey, was missing. Kay had taken sick after a poor oyster and could barely rise. The task of preparing the wine would normally fall to an assistant. But both were away fetching a shipment from Kent, and so William stood alone in the arched cellar, staring at the stacked casks and the note from the physician. To act meant breaking. Protocol to ignore it meant the king might drink tepid wine before a foreign dignitary, a dishonor that could stain the entire household. And so, quietly William acted. He selected a bottle of white muscat from the upper shelves, its seal bearing the mark of Florence. He wrapped it in linen, submerged it in the coldest cistern, and checked it every 10 minutes, rotating the bottle with care. Then he fetched a silver basin, one reserved for high occasions, and filled it with chilled river water. Kay carried both to the servery, head down, steps light. He said nothing to the steward, nothing to the cupbearer. He simply placed the basin on the sideboard and bowed. The Venetian ambassador, history tells us, noted the drink in his journal, a pale cordial of the English court, served cold and sweet, a rare gesture of refinement. No one thanked William, but someone noticed. The steward, a sharp-eyed man named Geoffrey Bowl, made a note. And a week later, William's name appeared on the payroll with a rare annotation, service beyond assigned duty. From that day forward, William was occasionally, though unofficially, consulted on matters of wine. He remained quiet, obedient, but those who watched closely could see a change. A slight nod from the steward, a shorter wait at mealtime, a cleaner cloth left near his post in the rigid framework of Tudor servant life. This was not promotion, but it was movement. Still, such shifts were dangerous. If the gentleman of the cellar had taken offense, William might have been dismissed. If another servant had reported the act as ambition, he might have been whipped for overstepping. It was a gamble, and not one that most servants took lightly. For every William, there were dozens who tried and failed. Take Eleanor Fenton, a lady's maid in the household of Queen Jane Seymour. Eleanor was known for her quick hands and gentle brushwork. She once sewed a lace cuff so fine that Jane herself asked who had done it. Encouraged, Eleanor presented the queen with a handkerchief of her own embroidery, a bold, unsolicited gift. The queen smiled politely, but the mistress of the robes, seeing the breach of protocol, demoted Eleanor to laundry duty the next day, not for the gift itself, but for daring to offer it without instruction. That was the risk to rise. You had to move without appearing to move, which is why, over time, certain servants learned the art of invisible advancement. Memorize not just their duties, but their master's moods. They whispered tips to the steward about misplaced jewels. They placed extra kindling in the prince's chamber before frost, and they waited until one day, keened, their name moved one line up the registry. But this subtle ladder was not available to all men advanced faster than women. English-born servants received more trust than foreign-born, and anyone with even a trace of noble blood, however faint, might skip 5 rungs at once. Still, hierarchy did shift. In 1540, scullery boy named Thomas Blythe was promoted to assistant cook after a fire broke out in the kitchen. The head chef had fled. Panicked, Thomas stayed. He doused the flames with a pot of broth and pulled a burning cloth from the oven with his bare hands. The burns healed poorly, leaving him marked for life. But he never scrubbed pots again, and yet Thomas remained low in conversation. Even with his new rank, he still bowed to the yeomen of the pantries, still waited until all others had taken their portion. Still slept beneath the stairs, not above them, because the Tudor household was not just a place of work, it was a place of choreography. Every person a dancer, every movement a signal, and just as in dance, a single misstep could end the entire performance. What's perhaps most fascinating is how willingly the servants participated in this order. Few rebelled, fewer ran, most stayed. Not because they loved obedience, but because they understood the alternative. Outside the palace, there was hunger, mud, disease. The plague had returned by 1536, sweeping through poor towns like a dark tide. A place in the palace, even at the bottom, meant warmth, food, and the faint hope of safety. So they stayed. They bowed. They waited, and when the rules bent, they bent with them. But what happened when a rule wasn't bent, but broken? When a servant not only overstepped, but rose so far he could no longer be called servant at all. There was one such man. He started in the royal kitchens and ended at the queen's side. In the next section, we'll follow his story, a climb so steep and strange, it nearly rewrote what a servant could become. But first, ask yourself, in a world of velvet ropes and unspoken codes, what does it take to untie a knot that binds everyone else? In Tudor England, to change one's station was not just rare, it was bordering on unnatural. The world was imagined like a grand ladder that descended from God himself, rung after unmovable rung. Monarchs stood at the top, ordained by divine. Right below them, nobles by birth. Further down, merchants by profit. And at the very base, servants. A person was expected to stay on their assigned rung for life, occasionally adjusting their posture, but never their position. And yet, every so often, someone moved. Today, let us follow the story of a man named Thomas Culpeper. K. Not the infamous courtier associated with Queen Catherine Howard, no. This Thomas Culpeper was a different man entirely, one buried in the overlooked corners of the records, footnote, within the account books of Henry VIII's Privy Chamber. A minor name, a faint shadow, and yet his journey tells us something profound about the porous edges of Tudor hierarchy. Culpeper's origin remains hazy. Some accounts hint that he was the son of a disgraced knight. Others suggest he began as a mere page, delivering messages between stewards. What is known is that by 1530, he was recorded as a groom of the Privy Chamber, one of the most intimate posts in the king's household. This rank, though not noble in itself, came with unusual privileges. Grooms of the Privy Chamber were allowed physical proximity to the monarch. They were the ones who carried the king's basin for hand-washing, who helped him dress, who heard his sighs and curses in private moments, while dukes and bishops bowed in the great hall. It was these servants who helped remove the royal hose at night. This closeness was dangerous and powerful because the Tudor court, for all its speeches and processions, ran on access to whisper a request into the king's ear while he yawned at dawn. This could carry more weight than an entire formal petition. To hand the king a comb and receive a raised eyebrow in reply. This was politics disguised as grooming, and Thomas Culpeper understood this. He did not overreach. He did not boast. He waited. He learned the king's moods, especially in the hours when formal masks fell. He noticed which topics made Henry sigh with weariness and which made him suddenly alert. He learned to change the basin water before being asked to adjust the curtain rope without a word. And so, gradually, the king came to tolerate him, then to speak to him, then to ask him things, and just like that, Culpeper's world shifted. By 1534, he was being sent on small errands beyond his station, delivering messages to ambassadors, managing travel arrangements, advising on horses. These were not grand appointments. They suggested trust. Then came the fateful moment. One winter morning, Henry complained bitterly of the cold. His chamber was freezing. The rushes on the floor gave off a damp smell. No firewood had been set, and the coals were low. The usual yeoman of the wood supply had been dismissed for incompetence days earlier, and his replacement was untrained. Without waiting for a command, Culpeper fetched the kindling himself. He stoked the hearth. He opened the shutters to release the musty air, then closed them quickly against the frost. He brought the king's fur-lined cloak and placed it over his shoulders. Quietly, Henry, irritated moments before, now grunted in approval. He looked at Culpeper for a long moment and said, "You think like a man of rank." That single sentence was not recorded in any official chronicle, but it passed through the mouths of stewards, scribes, and servants until it reached the kitchens, the laundries, and the gatehouse. Soon after, Culpeper was granted a riding horse, then a private room, eventually land. It is not quite correct to say that he rose through merit alone. No one did, but he rose through presence, through precision, through silence, through knowing exactly when to move and when to remain absolutely still. By the late 1530s, Thomas Culpeper was no longer called boy by other servants. He was called Master Culpeper. And yet there was tension, because the rules of hierarchy were not built for such transitions. The noblemen in court eyed him with disdain. The older grooms whispered that he must be hiding something. Some called him dangerous, others a toady. Few called him what he was becoming, indispensable. Still, the tides turned further when Henry VIII's health began to fail in the 1540s, when ulcers on his legs made walking difficult. When his temper darkened, Culpeper was one of the few he allowed near. Doctors and advisors often left the chamber shaking, but Culpeper remained. There is a note in the physician's log from 1545 that reads, "Medicine delivered via Master C, as direct attendance was refused." That single line shows how far Culpeper had come. He was no longer just a servant. He had become a conduit, but such a place was treacherous. To stand so near the king meant you could fall by inches. All it took was a whisper of scandal, a misplaced word, a misunderstood glance. One morning, your name was in the royal account book. The next, you were in the Tower, and indeed, there was a moment, faint and flickering, when that nearly happened, in a letter intercepted by the precept court secretary in 1546. There was mention of C in the matter of the Queen. For weeks, speculation swirled. Said Culpeper, had he meddled in court affairs beyond his post? We may never know the full truth. The Queen in question may have been Catherine Parr, a woman of sharp mind and religious sympathy. Some say Culpeper acted as a go-between for her correspondence. Others say he simply knew too much, but no charges were brought. Perhaps Henry protected him. Perhaps the evidence was too thin. Or perhaps, and this is the version that most often survives in the quiet pages, Culpeper had learned the greatest skill of all: when to disappear. He retired from court life in 1547, shortly after Henry's death. No formal dismissal, no disgrace. It's just a gentle fading. His name appears once more in the inheritance records of a modest estate outside Hertfordshire, and then no more. But for a servant, that was a triumph, to begin with kindling and chamber pots, and to end with land. There were others who tried. Many were crushed. A few succeeded, but none so quietly, so precisely as Culpeper. His story, though buried, is not so unusual as one might think. For while Tudor England wore its hierarchies like iron, there were always those who learned how to reshape that. Tease metal through watching, waiting, and warming the right hands at the right time. Would the kings of old have slept as well if they knew their comforts were built on such quiet ambition? Would the noblemen have strutted so boldly if they realized their shadows were cast by men who stood behind them, holding not titles, but tongs. And does the difference between a servant and a master lie only in the name, or in the heat of the fire they choose to tend? If you were to visit the court of Tudor England in winter, say, in the year 1536, and step quietly into the Queen's chambers just before dusk, you would encounter a scene far less luxurious than you might imagine. Yes, the tapestries on the walls would be woven with golden thread. Yes, the carved bedposts would gleam with oil and candlelight. Yes, the air might smell faintly of lavender and beeswax. But beneath the courtly perfume, there would also be dampness, soot, and a certain persistent chill. A palace was not a modern house. It was a drafty, creaking structure of stone and timber. Its heat easily lost, and its corners ever cold. And it was in this setting that one of the most peculiar roles in the Queen's household revealed itself most clearly: the preparation of her bed. Specifically, the warming of it. Let us turn our attention to a lesser-known incident. One recorded briefly in a household note dated January 3rd, 1536. In it, a chamberwoman named Mistress Ellen Sparrow is mentioned in connection with the mishandling of her Grace's bedding. No further explanation is offered, no punishment described, just the note and the silence that followed it to understand what happened that day. With the fire, earlier in the afternoon, a servant would ensure that the hearth in the Queen's chamber was lit. But this fire, often a low and cautious one, was not enough to keep the whole room warm, especially not the bedding. Feather mattresses, thick wool blankets, and linen sheets retained cold stubbornly. If the Queen were to slide under them without preparation, it would be like crawling into a coffin of frost. Hence, the use of a bed warming pan. This device, usually made of brass or copper, resembled a large, flat kettle with a long wooden handle. It would be filled with glowing coals from the main fire. Then, carefully, very carefully, the warming pan would be slid between the bed sheets and gently passed across the mattress to heat it. The risk was obvious. Too fast, too slow, and the mattress might scorch. Too clumsy, and the sheets might catch flame. Too inattentive, and ashes might spill. The task required delicacy, balance, and timing. Instead, it fell to women of slightly higher-ranked chambermaids, or gentlewomen of the bedchamber, who oversaw the process. They did not carry the pan themselves, but they watched. They guided, They knew the Queen's habits and preferences, how long she liked the foot of the bed warmed, whether she preferred the sheets tucked or loose, if she wanted a pillow, flipped, or fanned. Mistress Ellen Sparrow was such a woman, young. Ellen was eager to prove herself, and the Queen, modest and mild-mannered by court standards, had no reason to doubt her. On the evening in question, a frost-bound Tuesday, Ellen instructed one of the fire boys to prepare the warming pan early. She wanted everything perfect. The Queen had returned from chapel with red fingertips and a quiet shiver. Ellen, with her usual briskness, moved through the motions, dismissing the boy once the coals were ready, lifting the lid of the bed with practiced care, and beginning the slow sweep of the warming pan beneath the sheets. She hummed softly as she worked. The chamber was dim. A single candle flickered near the hearth. The coals hissed faintly inside the pan, sending up the occasional wisp of heat, and then a clumsy turn. A small ridge in the mattress caught the edge of the pan. It tilted, only slightly, but enough for a few flakes of white ash to tumble out and nestle between the sheets. Ellen paused. She smelled nothing. She saw no smoke. The sheets looked touched, and the Queen was due any moment. So she did what many would do. She brushed the ashes aside, remade the bed, and told no one. But Lennon remembers that night. Queen Jane Seymour climbed into bed and almost immediately called out to her women. The mattress was warm, too warm, not in the comfortable sense, but in a strange, uneven way. A damp heat clung to one side of the bed. Something she said smelled wrong. Ellen hurried in. She smiled. She offered explanations that the sheets had simply held the heat longer, that perhaps the woolen blanket had absorbed more warmth than usual. The queen seemed uncertain, but she said nothing further until the morning, because that next day a mark was found on the sheets, a faint gray smear, circular, and another beneath it, a scorched patch on the feather mattress itself. No flame, no fire, but the unmistakable trace of smoldered ash. The chamber steward was called, then the laundress, then, eventually, the keeper of household order. All examined the damage. All asked questions, and Ellen, flushed and silent, answered carefully. She never confessed, but she did not deny. She merely said the warming was performed with care. What followed was not a scandal. This was not the fall of a nobleman or the execution of a traitor. It was something quieter, colder. Ellen was moved, not dismissed, just reassigned. She became a linen supervisor in the second chamber. Fewer responsibilities, fewer opportunities, a soft emotion, and yet her story survived, because the queen, despite her reserved nature, began refusing bed warming altogether. From that winter on, she insisted her sheets remained cold. She would rather bear the chill, she said, than sleep in something uncertain. Her decision was noted by visitors, commented on by ladies-in-waiting, and passed down in minor diaries. In one account, a French ambassador's wife observed, "The English queen sleeps in a bed unheated by preference." She is said to distrust the warming pan for reasons undisclosed. It is curious. That small change rippled through the court. Other noblewomen, eager to imitate royal habits, followed suit. Warming pans were used less often in upper chambers. Servants found themselves cleaning and storing them earlier in the season. The process remained in place for lesser households, of course. But in the elite corners of the palace, peculiar shift had occurred, all because of one misjudged sweep of hot ash. And here, you see something quietly profound about Tudor life. Not every consequence thundered from the mouths of kings. Not every change was etched into law or declared at court. Sometimes, history turned on softer hinges. A single scorch mark, a queen's discomfort, a servant's silence. And so we ask, how many rituals, how many traditions, customs, habits were abandoned, not with a proclamation, but with a pause? Else has disappeared, unrecorded, because someone like Ellen Sparrow made a quiet mistake. And did she ever, in the decades that followed, lie in a bed at night, fingers curled beneath a blanket, and remember the warmth that lingered too long? You wake up in a cold palace, the scent of damp stone and beeswax clinging to the folds of your woolen shift. It is February, and your role in the royal household is modest, but close enough to power that every whisper feels like a warning. This morning, the whisper is about ashes, about something that should have warmed the queen, but left her with unease. And everyone knows that something happened in her Grace's bedchamber. Whispers in Tudor England were not just idle gossip. They were the lifeblood of court survival. What was said in corridors often mattered more than what was said aloud. And when the queen herself quietly changed a habit, when she began rejecting the warming pan with a chilly glance and a clipped, "That will be all. Thank you," people noticed, and they talked in the servants' quarters. They wondered aloud, had someone tried to harm the queen? Was the pan sabotaged? Was this about the fireboy, about Mistress Ellen Sparrow? In the upper chambers, the talk was more careful, but no less sharp. Gentlewomen leaned in with lowered voices and asked, "Did you hear what happened with the linen? Have they replaced it?" The words always ended with a small gasp or a raised brow. The truth that no one had died and no crime had been committed almost made it worse. There was no clean resolution, no punishment that tidied the story. only a stain, a barely visible mark on the edge of reputation. And for a woman like Ellen Sparrow, that stain was everything she had once been on track for promotion, possibly even to the rare rank of mother of the maids, a role overseeing younger girls and organizing the queen's daily routine. But now she supervised linens. She managed lye and soap. She recorded damaged garments and replaced nightcaps, hands once folded neatly beside royal gloves, now scrubbed at ash gray cotton in cold water. No one said her name aloud in judgment, but no one trusted her with fire again. And yet, her demotion did not end the story. In fact, it only started a broader question within the court. Should warming pans be used at all? This may seem absurd now, but at the time, the idea of not warming a royal bed, of letting a monarch slide beneath unheated sheets, bordered on unthinkable. Heat was not just comfort, status. A warmed bed said, this person matters. That someone was there, moments before sleep, preparing not only the bed, but the message it sent. Rejecting the warming pan meant rejecting that care. And so, when Queen Jane Seymour continued the habit into the spring, even as the frost thawed and the palace grew slightly less bitter, the chamberlain took note. He asked quietly if she was dissatisfied with the household's operations. She replied only, I prefer my bed cold. This stirred a deeper anxiety. If the queen was silently criticizing her attendants, it could signal a larger reshuffle. Heads of service might be replaced, expenditures reallocated. Even the steward of coal and firewood, a low but stable post, felt the heat of scrutiny. It was then that the ember inventory began. The phrase appears in a single document dated March 1536, a record of heating implements in the queen's household, to be reviewed against waste and risk. It sounds bureaucratic, dull, but what it meant was this: every warming pan, every coal scuttle, every iron rake and fire tongue was now to be examined, documented, and accounted for. This may have been an attempt at safety, or it may have been a subtle attempt to find blame without naming names. Mistress Sparrow, who by then spent her days inspecting towels and drying cloths, was quietly told not to involve herself. She obeyed, of course, but she watched, and she noticed something strange. The queen's new linens, ones untouched by the old warming methods, were thicker, heavier, not plush, but woven tightly, designed to hold warmth without the aid of coals. In essence, the bedding had evolved, adapted. Her Majesty did not want the pan, so the household adapted to make her sleep comfortable in other ways, and still, she did not complain. This quiet revolution, this departure from a centuries-old ritual, might have ended there, but nothing stayed hidden for long in a court of watchers. A visiting noblewoman from Scotland, Lady Ailsa Grant, arrived at May. She brought letters, sweetmeats, and furs as gifts, and during her short stay, she was offered a place beside the Queen during one evening prayer. The next day, she asked a question that echoed across the privy chambers. Is it true, she said, that Her Majesty sleeps without warming? The phrasing itself, without warming, was enough to unsettle the courtiers. Sounded stark, unprotected. Yes, a lady-in-waiting replied. Her Majesty has preferred it since January. Lady Grant nodded. That is remarkable. My grandmother used to say it was only witches who preferred cold beds. The comment was meant in jest, perhaps, but it landed awkwardly, because the line between superstition and suspicion in Tudor England was thin, especially for women, and now the Queen's private choice had become public knowledge. From then on, the Ember incident became something larger than itself. In a world ruled by performance, it symbolized something. To some, it meant independence. To others, it meant eccentricity. And to the older generation of chamber staff, it meant the slow decline of order. One of the most senior women in the household, Lady Anne de Lawford, is said to have written in her private book, "This court is unmoored." there is no fire at its heart, only smoke that wafts where it will. She was not speaking only of bedpans. Meanwhile, Ellen Sparrow lived with a strange legacy. Though she was never dismissed, she was never forgiven either. Her colleagues treated her politely but distantly. The young ones who came in after her, fresh from minor noble houses, eager to prove their refinement, often whispered stories of the ash lady who nearly set fire to the queen's mattress. None of them ever asked her for advice. None of them ever sat beside her at supper. And yet, in the ledger of household expenses, her name remained Sparrow E. Supervisor. Linen and cloth. Efficient, punctual, reliable. History sometimes records loud events, wars, coronations, executions. But more often, it forgets the quiet changes. The moments where something old is set aside, not with a shout, but with a whisper. Ellen Sparrow's mistake was one of those moments. It did not cause a scandal. It did not make headlines, but it changed how one queen slept. And through her, how others would sleep too. Because over the next few years, as Jane Seymour gave birth and passed away, and as other queens came and went, the tradition of warming pans never quite returned to its former glory. Some said it was superstition. Some said it was modesty. Some said the queen simply preferred the cold. But those who had been there, those who had seen the ash, smelled the faint smoke, and watched Ellen's hands tremble as she folded a ruined sheet, knew better. They knew that in Tudor England, comfort had its costs. And so, as the spring of 1536 deepened into summer, the queen's bed remained cool. No coals, no brass, no second chances, and all because one woman, on one quiet night, had decided not to tell anyone that a little ash had spilled. By the time autumn returned to Hampton Court in 1536, the queen was gone. Jane Seymour had died from postnatal complications barely 2 weeks after giving birth to Prince Edward. The court, still wrapped in the joy of a male heir, quickly shifted. To mourning, black cloth was draped from lintels. Oasis processions grew quieter. Even the gossip softened into something nearly reverent. And Ellen Sparrow, the woman who once stood at the heart of a bedroom ember scandal, found herself increasingly invisible, not dismissed, not accused, not praised, just unnecessary. It was an odd thing to be in a world that revolved around duties. Everyone in the Tudor court had a purpose. Some were ceremonial, bowing, curtsying, translating the queen's mood into gestures and glances. Some were practical, cutting meat, lacing gowns, fetching coals, but to be there and yet be spare. That was a fate even exile could not match. By November, Ellen's daily tasks had dwindled to the bare minimum. Check the night linens, log the soiled cloths, return. By dusk, no one asked her to attend meals. No one asked for her knowledge of embroidery or her skill with twisted flax. There was no royal bed to warm anymore, no royal body to serve. And yet, history was still quietly rearranging itself around her, because while the mourning period darkened, the halls, the warming pans, never returned. It had become tradition now. Strange, unspoken, but stable. The queen's final habits had lingered in the air like clove-scented oil. Her preference for cold beds was now cited as an expression of modesty, repeated in noble circles as a symbol of her virtue and English sensibility. Warm beds, people whispered, were a French indulgence, a Catholic softness. Jane, they said, had been firm, clean, and proper. No one mentioned the fire that almost reached her ankles. No one spoke of the charred linen or the pale servant who had stood frozen beside it. Even Ellen Sparrow, who had once tried to explain the incident that it wasn't the pan itself, but a cracked ember box, and that she had caught it in time, stopped correcting the rumors. Let it be, she thought. Let the history rewrite itself. Still, her position at court grew more precarious. Following Jane Seymour's death, a light administrative shuffle took place. New ladies arrived. The Queen's belongings were packed, her chambers dusted and sealed. Ellen, listed as a linen supervisor, remained in her post, but was reassigned to the Queen Dowager's reserve wing, a cold, seldom used section of the palace meant for transitions. Her bed was smaller, and her tasks fewer. Her proximity to decision-making had vanished. There's no scandal here, no conspiracy, just a slow, procedural fading, the kind history forgets because it makes no noise. It was in this silence that something small but strange occurred. A letter arrived in Ellen's quarters. No crest, no official seal. The handwriting was light, almost too fine for parchment. Inside, just one sentence. Mistakes, properly folded, vanish like linen in winter. There was no signature, but Ellie knew the handwriting. Lady Anne Delaford, the same senior woman who once wrote in her journal that this court is unmoored. She had seen something in Ellen, not worth protecting, perhaps, but worth preserving. And that's what the letter did. It did not lift her name from obscurity. It did not call her back to prominence, but it gave her a kind of permission to vanish properly, quietly, with dignity. A few weeks later, she requested a formal leave of absence. Not uncommon for servants in mourning households. The record, stored in the palace's back inventories, reads, Mistress Sparrow, Ellen, granted quarters leave, personal grounds, no objections. She left without ceremony. No carriage, no procession, just her trunk and a letter in her sleeve. Some say she returned to Somerset, where she had once served in the household of a minor baron. Others believe she entered a convent under a different name. One archivist, writing in 1722, claims to have found her signature in a Devonshire household's laundry accounts, dated 1540 Sparrow, counted 12 bolts, 3 with Liburns. But none of this is certain. Ellen Sparrow disappeared into history in the most boring way possible, by walking out a side door, unnoticed, and yet her shadow remained, because warming pans never fully returned to royal favor by the time Anne of Cleves arrived in England. The court had changed. Her German customs, combined with an unusually warm winter, meant the warming pan was offered only once and declined. Catherine Howard, too, preferred lighter linens and a bed companion over fire. Catherine Parr reintroduced the pan, but only in a more mechanical form, a covered ceramic brick warmed by the kitchen hearth. The Ember Scandal, if one could even call it that, had ripple effects far beyond its original flicker. Fire safety protocols in royal chambers were re-examined. Linen types shifted from loose woven cotton to tighter flax blends. Coal storage was moved farther from the sleeping quarters, and, curiously, a short-lived position emerged: the bed watcher. Not a warmer, not a lady-in-waiting, but someone whose job it was to check the bed after it had been prepared, to ensure no smoldering residue, no forgotten tongs, no risk of spark. This role vanished by the end of the century, but its creation speaks volumes about what the court remembered, and what it feared. None of these changes bear Ellen Sparrow's name. History did not etch her into plaques, nor mention her in the letters of noblemen, but in the small ships of protocol, in the disappearance of fire from the royal mattress, you can still trace her outline. The Queen's choice, as it turns out, was not a solitary act of taste. It was a response, a subtle, political, survival-minded adjustment to an uncomfortable moment that no one wanted to discuss openly. Perhaps Jane Seymour wasn't merely rejecting warmth. Perhaps she was rejecting the entire notion of layered, performative luxury, the expectation that a queen must be swaddled like a feast, flanked by heat and scent and decoration. Perhaps she wanted distance, or perhaps she just didn't want to be burned. We can't know for sure. All we know is this: In one of the coldest winters of the Tudor period, the queen chose to sleep in cold sheets. Oh, and from that point on, history cooled around her. Not all revolutions are loud. Some begin with a folded sheet, with a pan set aside, with a name scratched off a ledger. Ellen Sparrow may have left no children, no titles, no portraits, but she left an absence, a silence in the fabric of court life. And in that silence, things changed. It is strange, isn't it, how much can shift because of one quiet woman, one ember too many, and a decision not to complain. We remember kings by their wars, queens by their gowns, but history, real history, so often moves in the hands of those who go unremembered. Tate, the ones who knew, won twofold linen instead of arguing, the ones who left before they were asked to. So the next time someone tells you that the Tudor court was ruled by crowns and swords, think of a servant's burned cloth, of a brass pan set aside, of a name whispered, then forgotten, and ask yourself, if you had been Ellen Sparrow, would you have said anything? Would you have stayed? Or would you, too, have vanished into the folds of history, perfectly pressed and quietly warm? If you were to walk the echoing stone corridors of Whitehall Palace in the year 1548, long after the fires had died down and the courtiers had retired to their chambers, you might see a strange sight. A thin boy in ill-fitting wool, bent forward, with a pair of tongs and a bucket full of glazed bricks. He would move silently, placing these bricks at the foot of various beds in the queen's wing. One brick per mattress was carefully wrapped in old linen, with a note of the hour it was placed. This boy's name was Alder, not Alder the Brave, not Alder of Essex, just Alder. No surname listed in the payroll ledgers. No coat of arms. Simply one of the nameless dozens who arrived at court through unglamorous channels. Perhaps the son of a cook, or the nephew of a clerk, or some shepherd's child who was once quick with firewood and so was brought along to help in the palace. Hearthrooms. Alder had one job: to deliver warmth, not in the form of fire or coal, not in the dangerous, fussy style of copper warming pans with smoldering ash. His job was to carry glazed bricks, flat, ceramic, oven-fired, that were heated in the palace kitchens during supper, then wrapped in wool cloth and delivered to sleeping chambers while the evening services ended. The idea, by 1548, was considered a great innovation. The bricks held heat longer than coal, but never burned. They could be reused indefinitely, and unlike braziers, they produced no smoke. Someone, likely a woman in waiting, with an eye for practicality, had suggested it after a near fire in the king's wing the previous winter. That fire had singed the beard of a Spanish ambassador and embarrassed the household for months. So bricks became the new fashion, and Alder, the boy with quiet feet and a strong back, became their keeper. No one called him by name during the day. In the bustling sunlight of the kitchens and servants' halls, he was just boy. Occasionally you, or lift that. But once the sun went down and the lamps were lit, a subtle change occurred in the hush of the royal corridors. Alder was someone. Pages gave way for him. Guards opened doors. Maids offered directions, because everyone understood if the bricks were late, the queen would not sleep. And if the queen did not sleep, the court would not rest. Her Majesty, Queen Catherine Parr, the sixth wife of Henry VIII, widow of the crown, and now stepmother to the young King Edward, had grown particular in her widowhood. Though once known for her intellect and firmness, she now found it difficult to warm her bones at night. Her ladies speculated in whispers that the long years beside the aging Henry had chilled her somehow, not just in the body, but in the spirit. So she demanded warmth, but not from coals, and not from pan-wielding girls with nervous hands. She wanted bricks, smooth, warm, silent. She wanted Alder, not by name, of course, not officially, Koski. One night, after her usual prayers, the queen sat at the edge of her bed and asked, almost idly, Who places the brick each night at my feet? Her chambermaid, startled, replied truthfully, A boy, your majesty. What boy? We call him Alder. And so it began, not a friendship, certainly, nor a mentorship, but a pattern. The queen would sometimes ask, Has Alder been? And if the answer was no, she would wait. She would not retire until the brick arrived. Alder himself never spoke to her directly. He would bow quickly at the door, set the wrapped brick on the iron stand at the foot of her mattress, and back away without a word. But in the strange, layered world of Tudor palace life, silence could speak volumes. It was said among the scullery pages that Alder had the queen's trust. Others scoffed. What trust? He carried bricks. He wore the same tunic for 4 winters. He ate from the kitchen scraps like everyone else. But there was no denying the queen slept easier on the nights he delivered the warmth himself. And then, one evening, he didn't. It was no fault of his. The brick ovens had cracked in the scullery hearth. The head cook's Sir Anthony Broadwater, who was more wine than man, had mismanaged the coals, and the fires sputtered cold by supper time. There were no bricks that night, only lukewarm stones pulled hastily from a bread oven and carried. Up the stairs, sweating steam, the queen's chambermaid accepted the delivery. Alder said nothing, but he knew. He saw the change in the queen's face as she pressed her hand to the cloth, and felt only a thin trace of warmth. She said nothing. Either she simply turned away from the bed and walked to the small hearth where a low fire had been lit as backup. There she sat and stayed. Past midnight. By morning, the queen had a cold in her chest, and the chambermaid was in tears. Alder was summoned, not to the queen, but to the steward of linens. It was not a punishment, it was a message. If the bricks are not warm, the steward said flatly, you will not carry them. We cannot afford another sick bed. The queen is too precious, too tired. Alder nodded. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he returned to the scullery long after. The others had retired, and he began cleaning the cracked hearth alone. He scraped soot from the edges with a blunt spoon, fanned the coals, chipped ash from the fire bricks. It took him hours. But by morning, the fire lit true. For the first time, Alder gave orders, not to nobles, not to cooks, but to the other page boys. He split them into shifts, taught them which bricks held heat longest, which claws insulated best. He even made small marks in chalk on the bricks to track which ones cooled faster. None of this was sanctioned, but by the end of the week, the bricks were warm again, and the queen returned to her bed. It would have been enough. That alone could have been Alder's quiet legacy, a restored routine, a smoother system. But then something else happened. A shipment of new bricks arrived from the queen's cousin in York. They were thicker, glazed with a strange greenish hue, and said to hold the warmth of the earth itself. But within days, Alder noticed something strange. The queen's sleep grew fitful. She awoke, sweating. The chambermaid said she muttered in her dreams. At first, no one connected the two, but Alder, ever observant, decided to test the new bricks himself. One night, after the court had settled, he placed one in his own cot in the servants' quarters. Within hours, he awoke dizzy and found the linen scorched. The glaze had cracked. The brick had oozed a thin, sticky fluid. The bricks had been overglazed, were poisonous when heated. He reported it quietly to the steward, who laughed. Do not be ridiculous, boy. You sleep poorly because you eat poorly. But Alder persisted. He brought the scorched linen, second brick that had leaked. Eventually, one of the kitchenaids, an older woman with experience in glazing, confirmed it. These were overfired, she said, holding one up. Lead glaze. Beautiful, yes. Deadly when hot. The queen's health was at stake, and so, without ceremony, Alder saved her life. Again, there were no titles, No coins, no public gratitude, but the new bricks were removed. The steward never doubted him again, and within a month, a new entry was added to the court ledgers. Alder, keeper of bad bricks, Queen's Wing, trusted for discretion. Brick handler only when properly trained. He was no longer a page, not a servant. He had become the keeper of heat. He was 16, but history never stops at its quietest peak. There would be more to Alder's strange journey, more risks, more lessons in warmth and silence, and the invisible rules of royal comfort. By the time Alder turned 17, his place in the palace had become an invisible fixture. One of those quiet realities that no one officially acknowledged, but everyone understood. He walked where he pleased. He spoke rarely. He knew every corridor, every hearth, and every chambermaid's rhythm of breath as she prepared a room. He carried the queen's warmth on his back, not just in the bricks he wrapped, but in the very way he moved, steady, uncomplaining, and always at the edge of things. And yet, in the careful hush of the Tudor court, even warmth could be political. The queen's health had improved in the months following the removal of the poisonous bricks. She slept deeper. Her color returned. Her prayers at morning matins grew longer, steadier. This pleased her inner circle, the women who dressed her, the steward who oversaw her household expenses, even the court physicians who had once blamed her illness on imbalanced humors. None of them credited Alder directly, of course. That would have been absurd. But they also didn't interfere, which made it all the more curious when, Hyde evening in late October, a new face arrived at the Queen's Wing. A tall boy, older than Alder, with better boots and a tunic made of clean linen, carrying a copper warming pan and a letter, bearing the seal of Lord Protector Somerset. The letter was short, formal, and written in a hand too elegant for sincerity, to ensure the continued comfort of Her Majesty. In the absence of full household provisions during this difficult season, I send my own chamber assistant, Master Percival Wexley, to offer his services and implement modern methods of nighttime heat regulation. The message was simple. The Protector, Edward Seymour, the man who ruled the country in the name of young King Edward VI, was inserting his own man into the Queen's private routines. Alder, of course, wasn't mentioned. He watched as Percival Wexley unpacked his supplies in the scullery, brass utensils, polished coals in velvet bags, a strange powder that he claimed sweetened the air. Everything about him smelled like lavender and ambition. Percival didn't speak to Alder directly. He didn't need to. From the moment he arrived, he took to calling Alder the Brick Boy, as though it were a nickname, not a job. Within 2 days, he had begun adjusting the Queen's schedule, arriving earlier in the evening to lay out his copper pan beside the bed, fanning it with a fine goose feather paddle. The Queen said nothing. Alder said nothing, but the chambermaids whispered. The guards glanced sideways. Something was shifting, because warmth in a royal chamber wasn't just about comfort. It was about trust, and trust in the court of Edward VI was currency. It wasn't that Percival was unskilled. In fact, his technique was precise. He fanned the coals carefully, used scented oils that left the Queen's pillows fragrant. He even stitched monograms into his linen wraps. But something was missing. Kay's Alder's bricks had always been silent, steady, unadorned. Percival's heat demanded to be noticed, and so, the weeks that followed, a quiet war of temperature began. On some nights, Percival's copper pan left the Queen's feet sweating, the air heavy. On others, his coals cooled too quickly. He adjusted, tweaked, innovated. Meanwhile, Alder observed. He took notes in the margins of unused ledgers, measured cooling rates, tracked the temperature at various points of the Queen's bed. He noticed that the copper pan, while efficient, lost heat from its seams, that the scented oils clung to the fabric and, over time, dulled the Queen's breathing. One night, the queen coughed heavily after retiring. The chambermaid reported a headache the next morning. It wasn't dramatic. No one blamed the warming method, but Alder knew. Still, he said nothing. Instead, he returned to his bricks. He cleaned them with vinegar and a linen cloth, sanded their edges smooth, began pre-warming them in a smaller hearth behind the kitchen ovens, a process that allowed for more even heat distribution. He tested new cloth layers, flannel beneath wool, double dash wrapped, and then, without a word to anyone, he changed his route. Rather than delivering bricks directly to the queen's chamber, he began placing them at the thresholds of the lesser ladies' rooms, the ones on the outer perimeter of the queen's wing. These rooms were colder, forgotten, the ladies less vocal, less favored, but within a week, word spread. The outer chambers were sleeping better. The women woke, rested. One even mentioned it to the queen, offhandedly. "Your Majesty, I don't know what you've done for the corridor's warmth, but I've not slept so well since Easter." The queen raised an eyebrow. The next evening, Alder was summoned, not by name, of course, but by location. "Send the boy who warms the outer chambers," the steward said. "Her Majesty has a request." Tudor entered quietly, bowed, placed a brick wrapped in double flannel at the foot of her bed. The queen looked at it, then at him, and for the first time, in a voice so soft it barely broke the candlelight, she asked, "Why do you not warm my room any longer?" Alder did not answer right away. He stood still, hands at his side. Then, finally, I was told the method had changed. The queen nodded, then waved her hand. "You may continue." And so it was done. Percival Wexley remained in the palace for another month. He was reassigned to the king's wing, a quieter position, still prestigious, but away from the queen's chamber. No formal announcement was made, but Alder returned. His bricks once again became the standard, and yet Alder's path didn't settle, because shortly after, another change occurred, not from within the palace, but from beyond. The queen's physician, a cautious man with tired eyes and a love for mustard plasters, had begun to suffer from illness himself. His absences grew more frequent. And so, with little fanfare, a new figure appeared in the queen's routine. A physician's assistant from Cambridge, barely older than Alder, named Thomas Elwick. Thomas was curious, too curious. He asked about the queen's sleep, about her dreams, about the temperature of her limbs, and one day stopped Alder in the hallway. "These bricks you use," he said, examining one. "They're fired ceramic." Alder nodded. "You heat them evenly?" "Yes." "With what kind of fuel?" "Coal." "Sometimes peat." Thomas frowned. "No scented oils?" "No." Alder looked confused. Thomas waved a hand. "No matter, it's the theory," and walked on. That night, Alder placed the bricks as usual, but he did not sleep. Instead, he waited by the lower hearth. An hour passed, then two, and then, just before dawn, he returned to the queen's chamber and checked the brick he had placed. It was warm, too warm. Someone had tampered with the fire, added lime. He reported it, not to the steward, not to the CHMBERMAIDS, but to the queen's personal secretary. A thin man with ink-stained cuffs and a habit of biting the quill when nervous. Within days, Thomas Elwick was dismissed. No charges, no noise, but gone. And Alder, again, said nothing. He remained in the queen's wing until her passing the following year. By then, he had grown from a page boy to a young man with calloused hands and a deep understanding of how warmth moved through a body. He would never be knighted, never appear in official portraits. But his name did appear one final time in the Queen's private journal, discovered years later. There is a quiet one who brings me peace each night, not through words or prayers, teas, but through steady warmth. I sleep only because he works. And that was enough. because sometimes the smallest heat leaves the deepest impression, and sometimes a boy with bricks saves a queen from silence. By the time frost gathered on the window panes in thick silver veins, Alder had become more than just the boy with bricks. Within the queen's household, he was a shadow with a purpose, a breath of warmth before the cold hours, a boy turned man. Who knew which rooms caught the wind and which door hinges groaned most at midnight? His title remained unwritten, his salary unchanged, but his presence was essential, like the slow burn of embers in a hearth long after the fire dies. And yet, even the steadiest flame must face its final winter. Queen Catherine Parr, the sixth and final wife of King Henry VIII, had endured much in her years. She'd buried husbands, survived courtly suspicions, navigated the dangerous affections of one of England's most tempestuous monarchs. But now, with Henry dead and the young King Edward seated on a fragile throne, her strength was quietly ebbing, though the court rarely said it aloud. The queen was not well. She still received visitors, still signed letters, T's, still stitched initials into her linen napkins and approved the weekly menus. But her voice softened. Her appetite waned. Hands, once decisive and sure, now lingered too long on her prayer book, still searching for something within its pages. Alder noticed. P. didn't change his routine. Not exactly, but he began arriving earlier, staying later, rechecking each brick twice. And instead of simply placing the warmth at the foot of her bed, he began lining the floor beside it with narrow, heated stones, ensuring that when she rose for matins, the cold tiles would not shock her bare feet. She never asked him to, but one morning, as he was quietly placing the last of the stones, she said, without looking, "You remind me of my brother." Alder froze. She continued, voice as soft as the smoke from the hearth. "He used to do this. Not the bricks, of course, but care without question, quietly, before I even realized I needed it." A pause. "Do you have siblings?" Alder shook his head. "No, Your Majesty." A silence followed, long and thoughtful. "Then we shall pretend," she said at last, "that we are each other's." It was the only personal thing she ever said to him, and it was enough. That winter brought with it a kind of quiet dread, not of war or plague, though those lingered always at the edges of mist. Tudor life, but of change. The palace itself seemed to know it. The beams creaked more at night. The fireplaces smoked more than usual. The servants whispered more than they spoke aloud. And still, Alder carried his bricks. One evening, he returned from the kitchen hearth with a fresh set of warmed stone blocks, wrapped in fine wool and tucked into his coat tie. He passed the queen's outer rooms and noticed something peculiar. The scent of lavender, faint and artificial, hung in the air. The same scent Percival Wexley once favored. But Percival had been gone for months. Alder entered the queen's chamber with caution. The room was lit only by 2 stubby candles and a fire that crackled with a strangely sharp scent. Not smoke, but something acrid, almost metallic. The queen lay still. Her ladies hovered nearby, tense. The physician turned to Alder and nodded toward the foot of the bed. "Place the bricks there, gently." He obeyed. She was fevered. That was clear. Her breath came in short sighs. Her fingers clutched the edge of her coverlet like a drowning woman might hold a rope. The physician, an older man with trembling hands, shook his head. "We've tried everything," he murmured. "She sleeps, but fitfully. She mumbles about heat. Not enough, then too much." Alder said nothing, but as he laid the final brick, he reached under the bed frame and checked the floor. It was warm, too warm. Someone had placed a brazier underneath the bed, a crude one. Not the usual iron model, but a portable pan with unclean coals. Alder pulled it out slightly, sniffed. Lime and pitch. Improper fuel. Poisonous fumes. He didn't wait. He extinguished the brazier with wet cloth, dragged it out. "Kid," and opened the nearest window an inch, just enough to draw the fumes away without chilling the queen. Her ladies watched in silence, stunned, and then, for the first time, Alder spoke aloud in front of them. Only bricks, clean, fired ceramic, heated slow, double-wrapped. A command, not a request. The physician blinked, then nodded. Alder remained in the room the entire night. He rotated the bricks every 2 hours, slipping fresh ones in from his stash outside the chamber. He watched the queen's breath even out, her fingers unclenched by morning. She stirred, only briefly, but it was enough. Alder stepped back, exhausted, soot on his sleeves, his eyes red from smoke. The chambermaid, one who had once teased him as fireboy, offered him warm bread and a seat by the wall. He declined the bread, but sat down, finally, beside the hearth. The queen recovered, but not for long. Spring came, and with it, a letter from her cousin in the north. It spoke of retreats, of resting places, of estates with softer air and gentler hills. The queen was to travel, not far, but far enough. Alder was not asked to come. No explanation was given. But one afternoon, a steward handed him a purse of silver and a folded note, for service rendered, and for warmth never forgotten. It bore no seal, no name, but the handwriting was hers. He did not cry. He simply returned to the kitchen, warmed one final set of bricks, wrapped them in the softest wool he could find, and left them quietly at the foot of her empty bed. Years passed. Alder never returned to court, but his knowledge of heat, of breath, of sleep and stone did not fade. He became quietly a tutor of sorts, not in the traditional sense, but in the way one man teaches another to pay attention to the way warmth spreads. Key, how to measure the slowness of fire. Key, how to line a wall with stone that retains heat for the night. Some said he helped build warming systems in abbeys. Others said he advised brickmakers on how to shape their wares for longer retention. A few whispered that he wrote a book, small and unassuming, about the ethics of comfort in places of power. But his name was never etched in stone, only in warmth. Years later, during the reign of Elizabeth I, a young servant girl tasked with tending the queen's bedchamber found an old linen wrap buried in the back of a cedar chest, stitched into its corner. In fading thread were the words, "For her cold feet and her warm heart." The girl brought it to her mistress, Curious, the queen's advisor. An old man who remembered the previous reigns smiled faintly. "Alder," he said, "the boy with bricks." And that was all, because some people are remembered not by what they changed, but by what they kept warm. Let's say, just for a moment, you're the king. It's sometime in the 1530s, deep within the reign of Henry VIII. You're not yet gout-ridden, not yet paranoid and bloated with suspicion, right? But the years have already curled your spine inward with the weight of power. You wear furs in midsummer, pace beneath stained glass windows, and frown often, not because you're cruel, though many believe you are, but because ruling an unstable realm from a damp stone fortress is quite, literally, cold work. You wake in the gray morning hours, surrounded by tapestries stiff with moisture. Your breath forms clouds before you, despite the roaring hearth, and when your valet draws back the bed curtains, you wince. The stone floor is like ice beneath your feet. Your hands are swollen from the cold, your rings leaving faint indentations. Where your skin once fits snugly, your bones ache, not with illness, but with chill, creeping upward from the marrow. Even the robes brought to you feel wrong. The velvet is too stiff, the fur too oily. You demand they be rewarmed, but the fire doesn't reach everything. Not the bathwater, not the shoes, not the crown, in an age without electricity, forced air heating, or even effective insulation. How does a monarch, a man who commands armies and reshapes religion, win his daily war against cold? With damp sheets and hot stones. That's where our story begins. The English palace. Unlike the sun-drenched villas of Italy or the tiled splendor of Ottoman courts, was built not for comfort, but for authority. Hampton Court, Whitehall, Richmond. Towering walls, tall ceilings, endless corridors carved from limestone and slate. Beauty, yes, but warmth, rarely. Henry's court, as bloated and ceremonial as it was, revolved around him like celestial bodies. And just as the sun provides light and heat, so too did courtiers labor endlessly to keep the king from shivering. One such laborer was a man named Master Toller. He was neither noble nor particularly educated, not a knight, not a scholar, merely a laundress's son who rose to prominence through an unusual specialty. Steam, yes, steam, not the mechanical engine kind that would come centuries later, but domestic steam, moisture, evaporation. He knew how to coax it out of linens and chamber pots, out of burning tarragon and mint bundles tossed into scalding kettles. He didn't speak much, but when he did, it was usually about wool or water or temperature. He began as a page, then advanced quietly to linen steward, and finally was granted an informal role, keeper of the royal vapors. It was not an official title, no scroll recorded it, but every chambermaid and groom knew what it meant. Toller was responsible for warming the king's clothing, bathing cloths, and underthings, using his strange methods, and his methods were strange. He would take dampened cloths, infused with crushed rosemary or thyme, lay them across bronze rods, and position them in front of fire grates. The cloths would steam gently, not too much, or the scent would overwhelm, and this mist would soften the air. He insisted that the king's garments not simply be dried, but steamed before wear, not scalding hot, but gently warmed with moisture, just enough to remain pliant and aromatic. He created what might be called the first steam closet in Tudor England. It was a room just off the king's private chamber, narrow, windowless, with a tiled floor and slatted walls. The walls held a series of wooden pegs upon which robes and breeches could be hung. The base of the room, 3 braziers, small metal bowls filled with hot coals, were positioned with surgical precision. Above them, copper kettles, always filled with water, constantly refilled. Into these he dropped herbs, lavender for calm, mint for clarity, rosemary for the king's aching joints. The room became a kind of shrine to warmth. The steam rose, silently, no boiling, no roaring fires, just the hiss of vapor curling through wool and linen, softening everything it touched. Twice daily, Toller would prepare the steam chamber, once in the morning before the king dressed, and once at night to warm his sleeping garments. Occasionally, he was summoned for emergencies, sudden storms, unseasonal frosts, or royal tantrums. A French ambassador once joked, "The King of England is steamed like a winter pudding." Toller was not offended. He considered it a compliment. There were challenges, of course. Too much moisture and the garments would mildew. Too little and they would stiffen like armor. Ventilation had to be managed carefully. The room needed to retain heat but not become unbearable. Toller developed a system. A small vent carved into the ceiling, opened with a cord-pulled shutter, allowed excess humidity to escape. He even adjusted for seasonal changes, swapping herbs based on what the king desired. Chamomile in summer, clove in autumn. One year, after an outbreak of coughing fits among the courtiers, Toller began adding dried lemon peel and juniper berries to the mix. The air in the chamber turned sharp and medicinal. The king found it delightful and insisted on calling it his forest mist. The other servants hated it, but no one dared object. Toller's role grew. Eventually, he was invited to prepare travel steam kits, portable boxes containing clay pots, drying herbs, and linen wraps. These kits accompanied the king on progress journeys, and local stewards were required to provide boiling water twice daily for Toller's ritual. he began training others, not many, just 2 apprentices. They were instructed not in fire building or soap making, but in subtle arts. How to judge when steam is too aggressive. How to detect sourness in damp cloth. How to place rosemary so its scent lingers without dominating. By 1537, Tala was being paid directly from the privy purse. A small note in the accounting ledgers of that year reads, "To Master Toller, for steam and warming of royal linen, £1 12s." Of course, not everyone appreciated his work. Some nobles found the idea effeminate. It is not Christian to perfume the king like a French courtier. One bishop once muttered. Others were simply confused. "I see no fire," one visiting noble said. "How then is the king warm?" Kala, as usual, said nothing. But the king, overhearing, replied with a smile, "Because warmth is not in flame, but in the air between." It was perhaps the only poetic thing Henry VIII ever said. In time, the king grew older, heavier, more prone to illness. His legs swelled, his breath shortened. His rooms, once perfumed with basil and mint, began to reek of ointment and decay. The steam chamber still functioned, but its duties shifted from comfort to medicine. The vapors became antiseptic. Toller's gentle methods were replaced by physician demands for boiling cloth and burning sage. Still, Toller stayed. He maintained the ritual as long as he could, even when the king no longer noticed. He adjusted the formula, diluted the vinegar baths, softened the wrapping cloths, and when Henry finally died in 1547, Stala was one of the last to leave his private rooms. After the king's death, Stala vanished from the records. No pension, no commendation. He may have returned to the laundry halls. He may have died that winter, like many who served behind the tapestries of history. But some years later, in a quiet manor near York, a minor noblewoman ordered a closet of heat to be built beside her chamber. Its design was identical to Toller's, braziers, herbs, rods for hanging, and a copper vent. The craftsman she hired claimed the plans came from an old man with steam on his breath and time in his boots. And so the tradition continued. There is something inherently strange about the idea of warmth as a symbol of power. Yet, in Tudor England, in a time of drafty corridors, damp, rush-strewn floors, cane, chimney, smoke clinging stubbornly to ceilings, it was exactly that. Warmth was not just a matter of comfort. It was a privilege, a rare commodity, portioned out not according to merit or need, but by blood and influence. And no one understood this quiet hierarchy of heat better than the people who worked behind it, like Master Toller. If Section 1 introduced us to Toller as the quiet, anonymous innovator who maintained the king's precious steam closet, then here we begin to peel back the broader machinery around him, because this was not just the tale of one man with herbs and water. This was a system, an entire operation dedicated to preserving warmth for a single man, while the rest of the palace, even his high-born courtiers, shivered in silence. Let us step behind the velvet curtain and see what that looked like. First, we must understand the structure of royal domesticity. A Tudor palace wasn't like a modern building with central plumbing or wiring. It functioned more like a self-contained town. Every major royal residence, Hampton Court, Greenwich, or Whitehall, was divided into a strict network of service spaces. The very top set the privy lodgings, the king's personal rooms, and just beyond that, a small ring of antechambers, closets, and withdrawing rooms. Each chamber had its own heating needs, its own climate almost, and then, as you drifted further from the monarch, the air grew colder. Literally, rooms reserved for ladies-in-waiting, scribes, guards, and guests might have small hearts, or none at all. Servants' quarters were heated only by proximity. If they happened to live above a kitchen or near a stables, they might benefit from residual heat. Otherwise, their breath froze on the air by dawn. The king's personal steam closet, then was not simply a luxury. It was a glowing center in a world of cold. It radiated importance. It whispered to every visitor that here, in this narrow room of vapor and linen, dwelled someone whose skin deserved more comfort than theirs. And Taller guarded it like a priest. Each morning began before dawn. The palace would still be dark, the only lights from guttering tallow candles, or the faint blue-gray illumination leaking through lattice windows. While others were still asleep on rough straw pallets, Taller descended to the lower chambers. There he visited the braziers. These weren't ordinary firepots. Each had been forged to Taller's specification, wide, shallow, with a slightly concave rim to hold the copper kettles without tipping. The coals were stored in a lidded brass bin and had to be primed exactly an hour before sunrise. Too early, and the heat would die before the king dressed. Too late, and the linen would be lukewarm. This precision wasn't just fussiness, it was the entire point of Toller's craft. Once the fires were glowing softly, he would add water, cold water from the servant's pump, bracing even in summer. The copper began to tick with heat, and then came the herbs. The ratios changed by season. In spring, more floral, dried chamomile, crushed rose petals, and a hint of lemon balm. Summer used sharper notes, mint and sage. Autumn required earthiness, marjoram bay, maybe a pinch of nutmeg if supplies were generous. Winter was dominated by medicinal smells, thyme, rosemary, sometimes cloves, or a scorched bit of orange peel saved from the kitchens. Each blend was mixed in linen, Sisay's little pouches stitched shut and tied with red thread. He never threw them loose into the water. That would be imprecise, messy, and risked oversteeping. The scent had to be balanced, not overpowering. Then he would test the steam, not with instruments, just with his palm. A brief waft, fingers slightly curled. He wasn't checking temperature, he was checking character. Was the steam too heavy? It would soak the cloth and rot it too dry. The warmth wouldn't linger, too aromatic. The king's skin might itch, too faint. He might summon the apothecary instead, suspecting illness. Toller, who spoke little and was often mistaken for a mute, had developed a kind of nonverbal dialogue with the vapors. They answered him in curls and swirls, and temperature shifts along the wrist and the clarity of their rise. Only when he was satisfied did he allow the linen garments to be brought in. The garments. The king's wardrobe was not merely about style. It was a system of layers, each with its own logic and season. There were linen undershirts, soft, white, and trimmed with narrow lace, woolen hose, heavy velvet doublets, undergarments quilted with silk floss, robes lined with fox or marten fur, depending on the occasion, and cloaks so weighty that it took 2 servants to drape them across the shoulders. All of these had to be warmed, but not all at once. Taller employed a rotation. Each article was steamed in sequence. A pair of hose while the undershirt was removed, a sleeve while the boots were being pulled. The goal was to ensure that no cold fabric ever touched the king's skin. The result? By the time Henry VIII stepped out of his sleeping gown, every layer he donned, from ankle to neck, felt as if it had been pulled from the lap of a summer noon. But what of the others? What of the men who served beside Tolar? There was Wren, the apprentice, who specialized in drying cloths between uses. There was Cecily, the maid responsible for stitching the herb pouches. And there was old Barlow, a gruff man who managed the coal supply and insisted every ember be stored in oiled sacks to retain moisture. They worked in silence, not because of discipline, but because of condensation. The steam room echoed. Even the smallest sound reverberated in odd ways. A whisper might carry through the slatted walls into the king's ears, so they worked like monks. Sometimes, when they were alone, Wren would hum, a low, repetitive melody with no beginning or end. It matched the rhythm of the dripping water from the copper lids. Plink, hum, plink, hum. This tiny world, a few square yards of slate and steam, became a kind of sanctuary, separate from the court's gossip, its politics, its executions and affairs. Here, there was only temperature and silence. Over time, the chamber evolved. Tala requested a second vent be added after a visitor fainted from the heat. He asked for a bench to be installed for garment folding. Later still, a glass mirror was brought in, an unheard luxury in a service chamber. The king could inspect himself mid-change without stepping into the cold corridor. But not all changes were welcome after Anne Boleyn's coronation. The queen's household demanded a similar chamber be built for her use. Tala was furious, not because he opposed equality, but because he knew the resources wouldn't stretch. 2 steam closets meant twice the herb supply, twice the coal, twice the kettles. His protest failed. A second chamber was built, but without Tala's oversight, it failed constantly. The herbs burned, the garments smelled sour, the ceiling leaked. The queen never used it again. By the final years of Henry's life, steam became more than comfort. It became necessity. His legs, ulcerated and weeping, required frequent wrapping. His flesh was often chilled, mattered the fire size. Physicians began requesting moist fumigations. Long sessions in the steam closet where Henry would sit alone in a chair, wrapped in linen, soaked with vinegar and juniper. Tala was present for every one of them. He spoke to no one. He simply adjusted the kettles. The king, heavy and sick, would sometimes groan, or mutter nonsense, or whisper names that no longer existed. Once, during a particularly cold January, he looked up and said, "If I had been born poor, would I have frozen before I ever reigned?" Tala didn't answer, but the next day he added wild thyme to the sachets. It was said to lift melancholy, and when the king finally died, his body was prepared for burial. It was wrapped in cloth that still smelled faintly of mint. When a monarch dies, the world does not stop. Not immediately. There is still bread to be baked, and guards to rotate, and braziers to be stoked. But inside the palace, the air changes. Not in any mystical or metaphorical way, but literally. When King Henry VIII died in January 1547, the fires were not allowed to go out, but they were not stirred as often. His bed was stripped. The steam closet was sealed for 3 days. Toller, who had served through the deaths of queens and miscarried heirs, stood at the edge of the narrow chamber and did something no one had seen him do before. He sat down, not with drama, not with grief, but with the quiet precision of someone who had just completed a long, thankless equation. His hands, scarred from kettles and linen pens, rested on his knees. Steam had thinned. The herbs had been burned and replaced. The linens that once carried royal warmth now waited folded, untouched. But before we leave this quiet chamber forever, there are a few more details to consider, things easily forgotten, yet telling, because the strange profession of preserving, heat of stewarding invisible comforts, did not die with the king. It merely shifted, adapted, faded into new forms. Let's take a final look at how warmth was transferred from one monarch to another, from servant to system, from ritual to memory. After Henry's death, the Privy Council moved quickly. Power had to appear seamless, even if it wasn't. His son Edward, just 9 years old, was proclaimed king within hours. But Edward did not inherit his father's appetite for heat. He was sickly, always sweating, and disliked close airs. The steam closet, which had taken years to perfect, was shut indefinitely. No ceremony, no thanks, just disuse. The copper pots were drained, the herbs dried out, the sachets grew brittle and broke apart. Toller, now in his late 50s, was offered a new post something in the laundry service for the boy king's summer estate. He refused, politely, quietly, and walked out of Hampton Court without a pension, title, or even a record of his years. His name does not appear in any official archive. No bust, no mural, no poem. Only one note, written by a fellow servant, survives in the edge margin of a linen inventory. Toller, gone, took nothing but his fingers and a pouch of time. But the idea he carried, that warmth itself could be curated, elevated, did not vanish. In fact, it evolved. During Elizabeth I's reign, the palace began experimenting with dry heat rooms, which were precursors to the modern sauna, not for steam, but for perfume. Garments were laced with powdered rose petals and placed on heated tiles to absorb the scent. Later, the Stuart times, doctors prescribed hot air closets for melancholia, calling them medicinal sweats. In the early Georgian period, a physician named John Wesley recommended heated flannels as part of a moral regimen to ward off impure thoughts. Heat, he insisted, purified both skin and soul, and in every generation, a servant, often unnamed, was required to rise before dawn, light a fire, soak cloth, monitor temperature, and adjust scent. Always behind the curtain, always below the stairs. One might ask, why does any of this matter? Why spend time remembering a man who boiled water for a king who barely acknowledged him? 'Cause history does not reside in declarations. It seeps into cloth, to wood, into the condensation that gathers at the edge of a window pane in February. Because somewhere between luxury and necessity lies a realm of work that leaves no mark but was, the time, essential. Because someone like Toller, silent, methodical, ignored, is why kings didn't shiver. And warmth, in its quiet way, changed everything. There's also something to be said about the hierarchy of heat. In Tudor times, heat was power. Not only political, but biological. At the humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile were governed by heat and moisture. The king's physicians believed that too much cold could unbalance the body, breed sluggish thoughts, weaken decisions. Thus, to warm a king was to stabilize a kingdom. When Toller failed, when the steam was too faint or the cloth too damp, he was not just making an error of service. He was, in the court's logic, endangering royal health, risking poor governance, and perhaps even tempting fate. It sounds ridiculous now, but when we speak of comfort, we often forget its political implications. Who gets to be warm? Who gets to feel safe enough to sleep? Who wakes up already clothed in heat, while others light fires with frozen hands? In later centuries, as heating became more democratic through coal, stoves, radiators, eventually electricity, the role of the bed warmer faded. It was replaced by objects, metal pans filled with embers, hot water bottles, finally, coils of wire beneath electric blankets, each one a small rebellion against centuries of inherited cold, each one the descendant, in a way, of a man like Toller, a person whose labor made warmth feel effortless, though it never was. There are stories, unverified but persistent, that Toller retired to a small village in Oxfordshire and continued his work on a smaller scale, that he heated garments for the parish vicar, that he dried blankets for the infirm, that, in one winter, taught a group of young boys how to blend herbs for better sleep, that he died at age 73 with his hands still smelling faintly of mint. No grave records confirmed this. No statue bears his likeness, but in an old chapel wall near Chipping Norton, faded carving remains, a circle with 3 herbs inside bay. Rosemary, timed beneath a single copper kettle. Maybe it's coincidence, or maybe, in some quiet, unsanctioned way, it's a monument as you drift now toward sleep. Perhaps consider this. What other forgotten crafts once shaped the texture of comfort? How many other Tollers existed in every court, every country, tending to fires we never saw? Not generals, not kings, just guardians of the ordinary dot. And if warmth, that simplest of sensations, can carry so much meaning, what other small acts shaped empires, unrecorded, unmarked, unsung? That perhaps is where the real history lives, not in the proclamations of the crowned, but in the linens they wore, still faintly worn from someone else's care. Asterisk, asterisk, good night, dot, dot, dot.